Hey, everybody. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay, it's 5:30, so let's go ahead and get started today. All right, good evening, everybody. How's everyone doing today?
Doing well. How are you doing, Dr. Tran?
Good, good. Yeah, it's our second lecture, so it's the end of the week for me. So I don't have any classes tomorrow, but hopefully everyone is doing well too. Okay. Oh, where's my chat? There he is. Okay. All right, so today the plan is we're going to go over anatomy, okay? And so we're going to have a very quick crash course. And so another name for this lecture notes could be, anatomy for dummies, or in other words, anatomy for engineers who don't study anatomy, okay? So we're going to go through kind of, rapid fire through kind of what I think are all kind of the most important concepts to know about the cardiovascular system. Um, we won't go too much into the names of the vessels because the names of the vessels are a little bit difficult. What I want you guys to really understand is kind of how the cardiovascular system is organized. What are the certain functions of certain structures, and how this kind of all plays together. Okay. Because what you'll see is that your cardiovascular system is not that different from like plumbing or like inside your house. It has a lot of the same components. It's just that we call them differently because they're a part of a human and not part of your sink. Okay. Okay. So are there any questions on that I can answer before we get started today? So you'll see me do a lot of these kind of PowerPoint presentations in this class in particular, just because there's just a lot of figures and a lot of pictures that are really kind of impossible for me to draw. So usually I don't like doing these because I like having the freedom to kind of draw stuff, and especially if someone asks the questions, it's kind of easy to kind of draw something on the iPad. But for this class, just because I have to show a lot of pictures, then there's going to be more lecture slides than normal. Okay. Okay. So here are our learning objectives. So we have quite a few things to go through today, and so let's get right into it. Okay. So let's start again just with just introducing the cardiovascular system. Okay. So we talked about this last time, but just to kind of refresh your memory, when I say the cardiovascular system, I specifically am referring to your heart, your blood vessels, and the blood itself, and the fluids that basically go inside the human body. Okay. And if you recall from Tuesday, the main purpose of the cardiovascular system is transportation, right? Because in your body, only like certain materials are either only made in a certain place or can only be absorbed in a certain place, and those need to be transported to other parts of your body, right? And so the primary example of this is oxygen, right? And so you take in oxygen when you breathe, and those are in your lungs. But then that oxygen needs to get to every other part of your body in order for you to, to have normal functioning. Okay. And the mechanism through which, oxygen goes from your lungs to the rest of your body is through the bloodstream or through your cardiovascular system. Okay. But there's other things that are transported too. So any kind of nutrients that are absorbed through your, intestines that gets transported through the cardiovascular system, enzymes and hormones that your body produces in order to function, and heat. We'll talk about that a bit later too. So your cardiovascular system also works as thermoregulation. Okay. Um, and because it's such an important system in your body, it's something that you really need to constantly maintain. So the way that we usually maintain these is through a well-balanced diet, not too high in fats. Okay. And then also through proper exercise. Okay. um, and that's those are all kind of well-known things. Okay. And your body itself is such a densely packed mass of blood vessels that if you took all your blood vessels and put them end to end, you'd make 60,000 miles. So that was all kind of stuff from last time. Okay. Okay. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into, what are the specific functions of the cardiovascular system. Okay. And so we just talked about, the cardiovascular system is responsible for transporting molecules. Okay. And so there's oxygen and carbon dioxide. That's, the obvious one. Okay. But, all the other vitamins, nutrients, hormones that need to get from one part of your body to another part, the way that it does that is through the bloodstream or through the cardiovascular system. Okay. Okay. And so another function of the cardiovascular system that we'll talk about today is actually to help defend your body from any kind of pathogens that you might that might get into your body. Okay. And so your cardiovascular system basically houses houses your immune system. So all the cells and all the systems that your body has to get rid of bacteria, to get rid of viruses, and also even to repair you from physical injury too. So like say you cut yourself, right? And then your cardiovascular system is going to be responsible for repairing your skin, repairing that tissue. Okay. Or even if you do something more severe, like maybe you break a bone or something, right? And so your cardiovascular system, it houses all of those cells and all of those systems to help you recover from that injury. Okay. Okay. So we talked about this last time too. So, the cardiovascular system is responsible for thermal regulation. And so anytime your body, is too hot or is too cold, your cardiovascular system kind of helps your body kind of maintain the perfect temperature. Okay. And the reason it does this is because a lot of the chemical reactions, a lot of the biological processes that happen in your body, a lot of them are really sensitive to temperature. Okay. And so for a lot of times, if the temperature is either too hot or the temperature is too cold, then your processes in your body are not going to function properly. So basically maintaining temperature is not usually not the first thing that people talk about for the cardiovascular system, but it's, again, one of the most important things. Okay. And the last function, this is a fairly minor one, but still also important, is that the cardiovascular system is also responsible for maintaining, the amount of fluids in your body. Okay. And so blood is not the only fluid that you have in your body. So you have, either like the interstitial fluid in your brain, or like, the acid in your stomach. And so the cardiovascular system also kind of helps in kind of maintaining this fluid balance in your body. Okay. So you can see, there's a lot of different systems or a lot of different things depend on your cardiovascular system. So it's really important to kind of keep it healthy and well. Okay. Okay. And so now let's talk about the components. Okay. And so the amazing thing about the cardiovascular system is that there's so many blood vessels in your bodies, and somehow doctors and biologists have come up with a really long and confusing name for each and every single one. So we're not going to go through that because I think it's kind of a waste of time. But what I do want to talk about is kind of the general structure or the general components of the cardiovascular system. And I did this in such a way to kind of relate it to, like a fluid system that you might find in a car or something, or you might find, in your plumbing. Okay. All right, so let's start with the blood. So the blood is, straightforward. And so blood is what's called the circulating fluid. And so that's the fluid that actually is in your blood vessels, okay? And so the fluid is the thing that actually moves. And so, all the cells, blood cells and everything, all the transport takes place in the blood, okay? And so any kind of plumbing system, any kind of, heat exchanger system, you have to have some kind of fluid that's circulating. And for the cardiovascular system, that fluid is blood. All right, so next let's talk about the heart. And so your heart is your pumping mechanism, okay? And so anytime you have a fluid that's constantly moving, you need to have something that's adding basically kinetic energy to the fluid, okay? And so for your plumbing system, there's probably a pump somewhere that's, adding pressure to the fluid to make sure it comes out your sink. And so for your cardiovascular system, that pumping mechanism or the mechanism that's adding energy to your blood flow is the heart, okay? And so your heart, you can put your hand on your chest or you can put your finger on your neck. Your heart is constantly beating, okay? And basically each, ba-dump, ba-dump, ba-dump that you feel from your heart, it's your heart literally like squeezing. And then that squeezing action is basically adding kinetic energy to the blood and providing it the energy that it needs to basically circulate throughout your entire body, okay? And so anytime you have kind of an internal flow system or any kind of plumbing, you need some way to add energy to the flow, and that's what the heart basically does for you. Okay. And so next we have the arteries. Okay. And so your arteries are a type of blood vessel. Okay. And so in this figure right here, I have arteries as an arrow going away from the heart. Okay. And so the arteries kind of serve the purpose of distributing the heart to where it needs to go, or distributing the blood to where it needs to go. Okay. And so all the blood in your body, at least at some point, it passes through the heart. And so from the heart, it gets the energy that it needs to, the kinetic energy. And then from there, it distributes to the rest of your body. Okay. And then kind of the streets or kind of the avenues through which it distributes, those are called your arteries. Okay. And so the specific name for the arteries, or the specific function or definition, I should say, an artery is just any blood vessel that carries blood away from your heart. Okay. And this is very key right here, because I think people get confused about, how they define arteries, because sometimes people think that arteries only contain blood that's rich in oxygen, and that's actually not the case. Okay. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. But for now, I want you guys to remember that arteries are just any blood vessel that takes blood away from the heart. Okay. Okay. And then next, after the arteries, we have the capillaries. Okay. And so the capillaries are your exchange system, right? And so these are the tiny vessels at the end of the arteries. Okay. And these are contained in all the major organs in your body. And these vessels are really, really tiny. Okay. And so you can see in this image right here, these really tiny blood vessels here are capillaries. Okay. And the reason they're really tiny is so that, they kind of want to maximize kind of the surface area on the blood. Okay. And by doing that, all the exchange processes can occur. So, if your blood is carrying oxygen, then, the blood vessel can drop off the oxygen in the capillaries because it's really tiny. And then, your organs can take carbon dioxide and drop them off in the blood, after it's done delivering the oxygen. Okay. And so the capillaries you can think of as really tiny blood vessels. Most times they're way too small for humans to see without a microscope. And this is where, the exchange happens. So anytime, blood needs to drop something off, pick something up, this happens in the capillaries. Okay. All right. And then after that, we have the veins. And so the veins are the collection system. Okay. And so after the blood is done doing what it needs to do in the capillaries, dropping off material, picking new stuff up, then it has to be collected so it can return to the heart. Okay. And that's the responsibility of the veins. Okay. And so the veins will take the blood that has just been used in the capillaries, and then it'll route that blood back to the heart. Okay. And so a vein is basically just any blood vessel that takes blood from anywhere in your body and brings it back to the heart. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this so far?
Dr. Tran,
Yep.
when somebody says like somebody got shot on the leg and they hit a major artery, would it be wrong to say it hit a vein?
Yeah. So actually, that's a good question. So artery is kind of misused a lot because that's the term people use when they say people were cut and then a major artery was burst, right? But it really depends on where they were cut. I think the reason artery is used more is because artery is when you cut an artery, and we'll talk about this later, is that the blood pressure in the arteries are typically a lot higher than they are in the veins. And so when you cut an artery, you're much more likely for blood to come spurting out and for you to lose blood a lot faster, just because the pressure in there is higher, right? And so if you cut an artery, basically you have a high pressure system on the inside and a low pressure system, which is air on the outside. So blood comes out pretty quickly. But usually in the veins, the pressure is not that high there. So if you cut a vein, then the blood it will still come out, of course, but it's not gonna be it's not going to come out as fast, so it's not as dangerous. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think yeah. So I think the exception to this, I think, is the jugular vein, which is that's a common term too. So I think the jugular vein just happens to just be a really big meaty vein that just happens to be run through your neck. And so you cut that thing and you're just going to lose a bunch of blood just because that vein itself is really big. But yeah, typically cutting an artery is more dangerous because it's a higher pressure system.
Does it have more pressure because it just came out of the working heart that was pumping it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Has a higher pressure, and then it also has like it's also carrying oxygen.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And then after it passes through the capillaries, it kind of loses that pressure because it's running through the capillaries and it's leaving some
right. Yeah. So
fluids
the
aspect would be it's losing pressure because of like mine losses.
yeah,
The blood-
exactly. Oh,
The
go ahead.
blood vessels and arteries have thicker walls, and they're like more muscly, because they have to squeeze it out to everywhere in the body.
Right, right.
And then veins kind of like slowly
Oh.
leak up, and so they have little pool areas where muscles contract it and squish it further up.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then to answer the pressure question, yeah, blood loses a lot of the pressure in the capillaries because they're so small. So they actually, it takes a large pressure drop to go from the arteries through the capillaries to the veins. So by the time you get to the veins, the pressure just tends to be lower because the blood had to squeeze through the capillaries. Yeah. Yeah, great questions, guys. Okay. And so for this class, we're mostly going to focus on, blood vessels. So, obviously the heart is something that's really important, but modeling the heart is something that's really, really difficult to do. So, the ones where we can actually, apply a lot of our fluid mechanics knowledge, we're going to be doing that mostly in the arteries and veins, which are kind of the bigger blood vessels in your body. Okay. And so let's talk about how all of this is organized. So typically, the way blood flows in your body is it leaves the heart, it goes to your arteries, and then it enters the capillaries and then goes to the veins, okay? And so you can see here, I have kind of two circuits. So I have one circuit called the systemic circulation. And so when I say systemic circulation, what I mean for that is that's where most of your body is, okay? And that's in contrast to the pulmonary circulation because these are the blood vessels that go to your lungs, okay? And so kind of the way to follow this chart is you can start maybe in the left ventricle here. And so in the left ventricle, you have blood that's rich in oxygen, and then it goes to the rest of your body, okay? And then it goes to the capillaries where it loses its oxygen back through the veins. And then after it comes back through the vena cava, which is one of the names of the biggest veins, it comes back to the right side of the heart, where then it gets pumped to the lungs where it regains oxygen and then comes back to the left ventricle, okay? And so the path it kind of follows is kind of like this figure 8 right here, okay? Okay. And that's kind of what I've highlighted here, okay? So these four chambers right here, these are the 4 chambers of your heart. And then these are your lungs. This is the rest of your body, okay? These guys are your arteries, because remember, they're taking blood away from your heart, okay? And then veins are the vessels that bring blood back. And this is an important thing because a lot of people think that, when you talk about an artery, it's a vessel that's rich in oxygen. So for most of your body, that's true. And so for most of your body, the arteries typically have, oxygen rich blood. And then once they get to the veins, they have oxygen poor blood. But for the pulmonary circulation, it's actually reversed, right? Because the point of the pulmonaries is to take the blood and then saturate it with oxygen, okay? And so as soon as the blood enters the pulmonary arteries, they actually do not have much oxygen or any oxygen, okay? It then runs through the capillaries inside your lungs, it gains oxygen, and then it comes back through the pulmonary veins, which have oxygen, okay? And so I want to make that distinction because I think it's a very common misconception where, arteries are not really just blood vessels that have oxygen rich. Arteries are just blood vessels that take blood away from your heart. And whether they have oxygen or not depends on if they're in the systemic or the pulmonary circulation, okay? Okay, and so let's talk about the heart and all of its different functions and its anatomy. Okay, and so let's start. Let's start by talking about the 3 different kinds of structures in your heart. Okay, and so let's start with the ventricles. Okay, and so your ventricles are shown by these kind of triangular heart chambers here on the bottom. Okay, and so these chambers are known to be very muscular. Okay, and the reason they're muscular is because these are the chambers that perform most of the work of adding energy to your blood to pump it through the rest of your body, okay? And so, you have 2 of them. And so the first one is your left ventricle. And so your left ventricle is responsible for pumping your systemic circulation, okay? And so your left ventricle basically pumps blood to all the parts of your body except the lung, okay? And so because it takes a lot more work to pump blood through the rest of your body, your left ventricle tends to be bigger and it tends to be more muscular than the right ventricle, okay? And then your right ventricle, that's responsible for pumping to the lungs, okay? And so it's an important job, but it doesn't require as much work as the rest of your body. So the right ventricle tends to be, a little bit smaller and a little bit less muscular, okay? And if you're wondering in the figure, why is the left ventricle on the right side of the heart here, is because this is your left ventricle where, if you're kind of from your own perspective. So, you know, from on the left side of your body, that's where the left ventricle would be. But we're viewing this heart as if, you know, you're viewing someone from the front. So that's why it's kind of on the opposite side. It always bugged me for the longest time. Okay, so that's the ventricles. And so your other two heart chambers are known as your atria. Okay, so you have two of them. So you have the left atrium and the right atrium. Okay, and so atria are your collection chambers that receive blood from the veins. Okay, and so you can see, you know, when blood returns through a vein, so either the vena cava or through the pulmonary veins, they enter in through the atriums. Okay, and so you can almost think of like the atriums as like a waiting room. Okay. So the atriums will basically receive the blood from your body, and then it'll release it to the ventricle when it's ready. Okay. And so your left atrium basically receives blood from the pulmonary veins, and those are rich in oxygen, and then it passes it to the left ventricle. And then your right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the rest of your body, and then it passes it to the right ventricle when it's ready. Okay. And then besides the chambers, so those are your four chambers of the heart, you also have several valves that are in your heart too, okay? And so the valves you can kind of see are these kind of white structures right here, okay? And the purpose of the valves is that they pretty much make sure that blood only flows in one direction, okay? And so let's take this valve right here that exists between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Basically, the purpose of that valve is to make sure that blood only goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and it doesn't come back the other way, okay? Because this is really important, because, you know, once the ventricle squeezes and blood comes out, you only want blood to go out of the heart. You don't want it to go back into the other chamber, because that would be counterproductive, okay? And so the valves, you know, they're passive structures, but they serve a very, very important purpose, okay? Any questions on this? All right. Oh, I see there's in the chat. Okay. Oh, there's a lot in the chat that I missed. Yeah, for some reason the Zoom is not giving me the chat. Awesome. Right. All right. So first, Alexander's question. So is there anything out there that helps damage artery? Let's say someone gets a cut and a general area of the artery, and perhaps it can't be replaced. Yeah, so so actually, you know, the platelets that what we talked about before, you know, then that also helps repair blood vessels too. So as long as the blood can clot in some way, then that can help out there. Yeah. Yeah, Michael, good point about gravity too. Yeah, so veins are working against gravity as well. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's see. Are the fluid properties of blood different from when it's carrying oxygen and nutrients? Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I don't believe so, because I don't think I've seen any cases where, you know, people have used different properties for, you know, arteries or veins, depending on if it's carrying oxygen or nutrients. But I imagine, you know, it does change like the mass, it does change the shape of the blood vessels. So probably it has an impact on kind of the smallest scales. And so when you're talking about flow through the capillaries, you know, where the blood, you know, those capillaries sometimes are literally the width of a single blood cell, you know, it might affect the blood there. But I think besides that, I think there's not too big a difference. Yeah, great question though. Okay. Let's see, back to presentation. Okay, and so now let's talk about the heart cycle, okay? And so because the action of actually pumping blood, you know, it takes place in certain stages, okay? And this is actually important too, because if you go to the doctor, they might use some of these terms. So it's good to know what they mean, okay? Okay, so let's first talk about systole and diastole, okay? And so when we talk about systole, or when systole is mentioned, basically what that means is one of your heart chambers or two of them at the same time are contracting, okay? And so when we say basically that the ventricles are in systole, we say that the ventricles are kind of contracting on each other, okay? And that's what happens when the chamber wants to pump blood. And so the opposite of systole is diastole. And so that's what happens when the heart chamber relaxes, okay? And so your heart's basically can't be, you know, contracted all the time. So in order to pump the blood, you know, it has to pump and then it has to relax. It has to contract and then relax, contract and then relax, okay? And so these are kind of the medical terms that they use for contraction and relaxation, okay? Why they couldn't just use contraction and relaxation, why they had to give it some weird names, don't ask me. Doctors are weird people. Okay. Okay, and so in terms of your heart cycle, your blood pressure tends to be a maximum when it's at systole, okay? And so you can imagine when your ventricles are at full squeezing capacity, right? So they're squeezed as much as they can, that's when your blood pressure is gonna be the highest, because that's when, your heart's squeezing the most, okay? Whereas, your blood's at a minimum during diastole. So when the ventricles are kind of relaxing and kind of coming back to its full form, that's when your blood pressure kind of drops to a minimum. Okay. And so in reality, your blood pressure is going up and down, kind of like almost like a sine wave, right? So it goes up during systole and then it goes down during diastole, up and down. Okay. And so when you go to the doctor, or when you go to Walgreens or something and you stick your arm through the machine, they usually measure your blood pressure in terms of two different values, okay? And so one common blood pressure is 120/80, okay? And so the first number that they give you, that's your systolic blood pressure. And so that's the maximum blood pressure when your heart is at full contraction, okay? And then your second blood pressure, that's your minimum blood pressure when your heart is at kind of full relaxation, okay? And so your first blood pressure is your systolic blood pressure, and your second one is your diastolic one, okay? And so that's why it's kind of reported as two numbers like that, okay? And the units for these blood pressures is measured in terms of what's called millimeters of mercury, okay? And so what this means is that if you measured the blood pressure using a manometer, then it would raise up 120 millimeters of mercury on a manometer, okay? And so it's such a weird and kind of arbitrary measure for pressure. But the reason they do that is because in the old days when they had to measure blood pressure, they used it with mercury manometers, and I guess that convention just kind of stuck for hundreds of years. So that's why we still kind of use the same unit for blood pressure. Yeah. All right, any questions on this?
Is your heart always in systole or diastole like operation, or can it be like just one is squeezing and the other is not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So typically your ventricles will contract together. And so both your right and your left ventricle will be in systole together and diastole, together. And same thing for your atria. So your atria will be in systole together and diastole together. But it's not like a trade-off, right? Because the systolic cycle and the diastolic cycle for the atria and the ventricles, there's a little bit of overlap between them. But they're not, it's not like one is on, one is off all the time. So, they both kind of have their own cycle that they follow. So systole and diastole just kind of refer to when they're contracting or not, but your two ventricles will be together and your two atria will be together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, question. So do I know about tetralogy of Fallot? So my friend has that condition. I'm not too familiar with her defects, but she had to have heart surgery. Yeah, actually tetralogy of Fallot is a congenital heart disease. So it probably means that she was born with those heart defects. And so I'm personally not an expert in it. I kind of just know what it is. And so that disease, there's basically 4 defects that are in your heart. And for some reason, I think they're still researching it. For some reason, those 4 defects are often seen all together in the same person. And so, if you have tetralogy, you have all 4 heart defects. So that's kind of why it gets its name. But beyond that, I'm not sure what it is or what those defects are. But it's tough because it's something that you're born with, and it's not and something you just kind of have to live with for the rest of your life. Yeah. All right. So, question: is an irregularity in blood pressure a main reason for heart murmurs? So actually, heart murmurs have more to do with the electrical signals in your heart. And so, in order for your heart to contract, there has to be a nervous, basically, signal that tells it to contract like that. And so, heart murmurs are more of a kind of an irregularity with that. Either that, or there's some problem with the valves. But the heart murmurs, it can have some effects on blood pressure, but blood pressure is more of the symptom of the heart murmur rather than the cause. Yeah. Yes. Our atrial contraction is super weak compared to ventricular systole. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So atrial contraction is much weaker because your atria don't really have that many muscles because they're not really pumping all that much because they're basically just passing the blood over to your ventricles. So yeah, atrial contraction is really weak. So it is kind of hard to pick up on the EKG. So that's why they look mostly at ventricular systole. Yeah, great observation. Mhm.
Professor,
Yep. Mhm.
can we say that this systolic is happening when the systemic pressure is in highest level?
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly kind of what they, or at least that's the term that doctors use. So systole basically, at least say you're measuring your blood pressure from your arm, your systolic pressure is just whatever maximum pressure that they observe. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And so I mentioned before that there are valves in the hearts, and so these are the names of the valves. Okay. And so the valves either get this name depending on where they're located or how they're shaped. Okay. And so the first thing we have is the tricuspid valve, and so this is the valve that exists between your right atrium and your right ventricle. So it's actually this valve right here. Okay. And so it gets that name because it has basically three leaflets. So that's why it's called tricuspid. Okay. And so the next valve is your pulmonary valve. And so that exists between your right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. So that's this valve right here. Okay. And that's basically to prevent backflow back into the right ventricle. Okay. The next is your mitral valve. And so your mitral valve exists between your left atrium and your left ventricle. So that's this guy right here. Okay. And again, that's to prevent flow into the backflow back into the left atrium. And so the mitral valve kind of has almost like a shark. It kind of looks like almost like a shark kind of shape to it. So it looks kind of funny. And then your aortic valve, that exists between your left ventricle, the outlet of the left ventricle, and basically the rest of your body. Okay. And so this blood vessel right here is called your aorta. So your aorta is the biggest blood vessel in your body. And that's basically responsible for distributing blood to the rest. Okay. And your aortic valve is, basically prevents backflow back into the left ventricle. Okay. Okay. And so let's define the major vessels that come from the heart. So we've seen some of these already. And so we have the vena cava, and so we have two of them. And so we have the superior vena cava on top, and then the inferior vena cava on the bottom. And so these are the major systemic veins in your body. And so after blood goes through all your muscles and everything, it returns through the vena cava basically. Okay. And so your superior vena cava is for the top of your body, and your inferior vena cava is for the bottom of your body. Okay. Next, you have your pulmonary artery. And so your pulmonary artery carries blood from your heart to your lungs. Okay. And so remember, the blood in the pulmonary artery is deoxygenated. And then after it visits the lungs, then it comes back through the pulmonary veins, which are these guys right here. Okay. And then just like we mentioned, your aorta is responsible for carrying blood from your heart to the rest of your body. Okay. And so it's connected to the left ventricle, and it's kind of the first artery that your blood kind of sees after leaving the heart. Okay. And so this is kind of the extent of the names that I want you to know. Okay. And so besides this, almost every other blood vessel in your body has a name, but it's not important. But I at least want you to know the names of the structures and the valves in the heart and all of the major vessels that are connected to the heart. Okay. Because these names come up quite a bit in the literature. Okay. Okay. And so let's look at heart valves a little bit more. Okay, so here's just to show you a picture. And so here's your aortic valve right here. And so as you can imagine, since this is the valve that leads, from your heart to the rest of your body, it's something that's really important. So if you have a healthy valve, it should open and close kind of very, very well. Okay, and so when it opens, it has a nice big opening so your blood can come out. And when it closes, you have this kind of airtight seal where blood can't come back. Okay. And so in order to achieve this, basically these structures right here, which are called the leaflets of the valve, they have to be both flexible and they have to be strong so that they can perform kind of a nice seal. Okay. But what can happen to people is that these valves can get diseased. Okay. And then when a valve gets diseased, basically they start to get stiff and they start to get leaky. Okay. And so this disease is known as aortic valve stenosis. Okay. And so that's why, in this picture, the leaflets kind of look like crusty, like kind of like, like old bread or something. And that's kind of the sensation that they want to convey is that, these valves are not kind of, nice and flexible things. They're kind of brittle and kind of crusty, and they kind of, don't close all the way because they're kind of stiff. Okay. And so if you have a healthy valve, it's something that's, flexible, but still very strong. Okay. But as you age, this tends to happen a lot to people. And so a lot of people actually have to undergo valve replacements just to make sure that their valves are working properly. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about the blood vessels themselves. Okay, and so this is kind of the anatomy for any kind of blood vessel, and so kind of like what was mentioned earlier in the lecture today. Someone mentioned that your blood vessels are actually they're not just tubes, so they're actually muscular structures. Okay, and so the way that we break up the anatomy of the blood vessel is into 3 separate layers. Okay, and so the first layer is called the adventitia. And so that's this kind of very thin layer out here. And so it's primarily made of a substance called collagen. Okay. And so collagen is a biomaterial that's, that's where, your blood vessels get a lot of its structural strength from. Okay. This middle layer here is called the media. Okay. And so this is mostly comprised of smooth muscle. And then the materials that it's actually made of are called elastin. Okay, and so elastin is another kind of structural biomaterial in your body, and elastin is kind of more for its elastic property. So that's kind of lets blood vessels kind of be flexible and elastic. Okay, and there's also some collagen in here to kind of give it some structural strength as well. Okay, and then the innermost layer here is called the intima, and so the intima has the very important role because this is actually what's in contact with your blood. Okay. And usually the intima is only, about 1 cell thick. Okay. So there's basically only a single layer of cells that separates your blood from, your media, which is the muscle in your blood vessels. Okay. Right. And so, the ratio of these 2 materials here, collagen and elastin, is these determine, how structurally strong and how structurally flexible your blood vessels are. Okay. And so depending on where you are in your body, because every blood vessel is kind of exposed to different conditions, you're going to have different ratios of this elastin and collagen. Okay. Right. And so not only are the ratios of elastin and collagen going to be different in different parts of your body, but the thickness of the wall itself also adapts to different parts, depending on what kind of forces and what kind of pressures that the vessels need to see. Okay. So that's just kind of a quick primer on vessel anatomy. So it's not just I like to use the analogy that blood vessels are like rubber tubes, but it's a lot more complicated than rubber tube because you have different layers of different cells and different muscles, in your blood vessels. Okay. Okay, and so now let's start talking about the blood itself, right? And so blood, it's not just a fluid, and so it's actually a suspension of different particles. Okay. And so these cells and all the blood cells and that you know about, they're suspended in what's called a plasma for your blood. Okay. When you look at blood kind of in your larger arteries, it mostly behaves like a fluid, which is kind of why we treat it as such. But in reality, it's actually a plasma filled with bunch of tiny cells. Okay. And the exact properties of blood, they're still actually being researched today. And so you would think that, by this point, we would understand blood very, very well. But, because it's such a complex, fluid with so many different cells and, different behaviors depending on where you are in the body, there's still a lot of research that's going on. Okay. And the main difficulty is that, it's hard to measure things in your body, right? And if you take blood out of someone and you put it into a machine, that blood's not exactly the same because then the cells in there, they might not act the same and things like that. So it's a really difficult topic to really measure the properties of blood. And so for performing engineering work, we have some approximations that we can make. But in reality, the real, minute properties of blood is still, a pretty heavy topic of research. Okay. And so, there's lots of different cells in your body, but we're going to talk about kind of 3 main ones. We're going to talk about red blood cells, which I like to shorten as RBCs. We'll talk about white blood cells, WBCs, and also platelets. Okay. Before I do that, are there any questions on this part here? All right, question in the chat. So how does donating plasma work? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up and get back to you, because I imagine it's more general than just donating blood. Because when you donate blood, it comes with all the cells that are inside your body. That's why when you donate blood, you have to match blood types. But I guess when they say you're donating plasma, I'm guessing they're just meaning just the kind of the fluid that kind of holds it. Yeah, plasma is just kind of the term that it's kind of a fluid that holds all the cells. Yeah. Oh, so Joshua says, take out the cells and pump it back into you and take only the plasma. Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so Joshua's saying that, when you donate plasma, you take out all the cells from your blood, and then you just take the plasma. You put the cells back in your body. Yeah. So the plasma is just the suspension fluid, basically. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, good question. Okay. So let's talk about red blood cells. So red blood cells, so the formal name for them are called erythrocytes. And so by far, your red blood cells make up the majority of the blood cells in your human body, okay? And so if you kind of quantify it by volume, the stat that they use for it is called hematocrit, okay? And so if you go to the doctor and they measure your hematocrit, they basically just mean the percent by volume of your blood, of the red blood cells in your blood, okay? And so men typically have a hematocrit of around 41 to 52%, while women typically have a hematocrit of 36 to 48%, okay? Okay, and so red blood cells are really important because these are the main guys that's gonna transport your oxygen, okay? And so, if you've seen some kind of cartoon animations of red blood cells before, they kind of have this kind of almost like a Frisbee with a dimple in it, I guess. That's what I like to think about it. But this shape is really important because it helps it carry and unload oxygen really, really efficiently. Okay. Okay. And what's interesting is that if you exercise regularly, these are you tend to have higher hematocrit than other people, because if you're using your muscles really regularly, then your body has a very much higher demand for oxygen, and so to kind of satisfy that demand, your body just naturally produces more red blood cells, so that to make sure that your blood is much more efficient at carrying oxygen. Just to kind of make sure that everything's good. Okay, and then you can, from these measurements right here, you can kind of see the relative size of the red blood cells. Okay, and so they're only about 2 micrometers thick, and then kind of the diameter is about 7.5 micrometers. So they're really, really tiny. So you're not going to see these with your naked eye, but if you look at them under the microscope, they have this kind of shape. Okay. So this right here is just an animation. So red blood cells aren't actually shiny like this, but this is how we kind of view or we imagine the red blood cells in your blood. Okay. Okay. And so next we'll talk about the white blood cells. And so the scientific name for these are leukocytes. Okay. And they actually they don't make up that much of the volume. So they actually only occupy about 0.7% of your blood volume. Okay. And the white blood cells, what they're primarily responsible for is they're responsible for your immune response, okay? And so your white blood cells say, you have some bacteria, you have some viruses in your body, your white blood cells are gonna be the one that are kind of, take them down, basically, okay? And so white blood cells is kind of like a general name. So there's actually, various types that can specialize in attacking different kinds of pathogens, okay? And so you can see some of the different types right here, okay? And so, if your body does detect an infection, then your body will just kind of naturally create more white blood cells to combat them. Okay, and so that's what's known as your immune response. And if you've heard the disease leukemia before, this is a very deadly disease, obviously. And what it refers to specifically is an abnormally high production of white blood cells. Okay. And this is really dangerous because then these white blood cells can actually start attacking your body and destroying, important parts of it. Okay. And so that's why, leukemia is such kind of a very dangerous disease. Okay. Okay. Are there any questions on red blood cells or white blood cells? Yeah, so Josh made a good point in the chat. So if you donate plasma, they're able to make 2 pints of blood compared to 1 pint of that you donate. Okay. Oh, still writing. Okay. Yeah, it's a lot to write here. Mm-hmm. Do you need to go, do you need me to go back to the red blood cell, or do you just need to write down this one?
Professor, just to make sure you're posting the PowerPoint, correct or no?
Yes, yeah, the PowerPoints, it's all posted on Canvas. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Got it, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So question in the chat. So do we know why white blood cells start attacking our own bodies? Yeah, that's a great question. A question that I'm not qualified to answer, unfortunately. And so kind of my understanding of white blood cells is kind of just limited to what we have here in this presentation. But that would be definitely a good question for like a doctor or biologist. Yeah. All right. Joshua, you good? Okay. All right, let's keep going. Okay, and so now the last type of blood cell that we'll go over is the platelets. And so the platelets are the cutest blood cell because they're the smallest. Okay, and your platelets are primarily responsible for blood clotting and tissue repair. Okay, and so this is kind of function number 2 that we talked about at the beginning of class today. Okay. And so, whenever your body needs to repair something, say like you cut yourself, or say that your tissue needs to be repaired, the platelets are the ones that actually come in and start repairing it. Okay. Okay. And so your platelets, they're actually flowing through your bloodstream all the time, but they don't actually do anything regularly because they're kind of unactivated. Okay. And when they're unactivated, that means they kind of just go along with the flow. So they're kind of like passive particles that kind of just go along and don't really do anything. Okay. But once they're activated, they can start to detect an area where it needs tissue repair, and then it naturally just kind of floods to that area and it kind of sticks to it. Okay. And then once the platelets stick to that, then they kind of encourage other platelets to come stick to them as well. And so it's kind of almost like an accumulation of these platelets. So it's actually really interesting because say like you cut yourself and you have a tear in your blood vessel, right? And so the first thing that gets there is going to be a platelet that kind of sticks to the outside, and then that platelet is going to get another platelet to attach to him, which is going to get another platelet to attach to him, until eventually enough platelets attach together in order to close your wound. Okay. And that process doesn't happen quickly, so a lot of times it happens for a while. So that's why whenever you cut yourself, you have to put a Band-Aid on it and to kind of force it to not have blood come gushing out of your body, so that the platelets get a chance to kind of attach there and kind of repair the tissue. Okay. And if you ever heard of the term blood thinner, a blood thinner is a type of chemical or a type of medicine that you can take that kind of inhibits this this activation sequence. Okay. And so if you have a blood thinner, it basically prevents your blood from clotting, and it prevents your platelets from activating. Okay. And so some people take this because they're in danger of their blood clotting in other parts of their body. And so this is very common if you have basically an artificial heart, or what's called a ventricular assist device, which is a device they implant in your body to help your blood, or to help your heart pump. Then those are susceptible for clotting. Okay. Because as the blood kind of flows through that machine, it kind of sometimes it triggers this activation response, and sometimes the blood can clot inside that ventricular assist device, which is obviously very bad, because if that device gets gunked up, then it can't operate. Then you can't pump blood in your body. And so to kind of prevent that, what happens is if you have one of those devices implanted in you, then they give you blood thinners to basically make sure that your platelets aren't going to activate, and they aren't going to clot up that machine. Okay. But the danger of that is that if you take blood thinners, then your blood can't clot anywhere else. And so kind of the morbid joke that doctors actually say is that if you have blood thinners, then you can scrape your knee on the playground and like bleed to death, because there's no way for your blood, it'd be a lot harder for your blood to clot and actually repair that wound. And so blood will just continue gushing out of your body. And so it's actually not going to repair. So you have to be very careful with blood thinners. So if you know anyone that's on blood thinners, tell them to be extra careful when they're playing a basketball at the park, because you don't want them to get any cuts or to scrape their knees. Yeah. Okay. And so one other factor that can activate platelets is actually viscous shear stress. Okay. And so once we start getting into the fluid mechanics, we know that, whenever you have viscous flow of a fluid through a pipe, there's shear stress that occurs in the fluid due to viscosity. Okay. And so sometimes what can happen is that, if you have an abnormally high level of viscous shear stress, then this could kind of accidentally trigger your platelets to clot in your body. Okay. And obviously, this is really bad because, you only want your blood to clot in like areas of wounds. You don't want your blood to clot, like in the middle of your heart or something, or in the middle of an important blood vessel, because that's going to block blood from reaching the other parts of your body. And so oftentimes, if you have this kind of accidental clotting, this is what can lead to heart attacks and strokes. Okay, any questions on platelets? Okay. All right. And so, once we start doing the fluid mechanics and once we start doing the CFD, viscous shear stress, which we'll call it wall shear stress, is something that's really important, because that's something that doctors want to know, because they want to make sure that your platelets aren't getting like accidentally activated in your bloodstream. Okay. Okay. And so, now that we're done talking about all the different cells that are in your blood, it's kind of fair to ask, is blood actually not a fluid, right? And so we talked about earlier that blood's actually a plasma, right? And so when you compare blood to like kind of a pure fluid, like like water or something, they're different, right? So because blood has, trillions and trillions of these cells that are suspended in the fluid, technically it doesn't follow the same rules as like a traditional fluid. So, whereas for fluid, you can apply things like Navier-Stokes or Bernoulli equation or conservation of mass to measure its response. For blood, technically you can't do that because it's a suspension of particles, right? And so it's like the same thing with sand, right? And so sand, we know sand is not technically a fluid because it's a bunch of small things that are itchy and they get everywhere, and most people hate them, right? But sand can still flow like a fluid, right? And so there's still some, even though sand technically isn't a fluid, there are some situations where we can model it like a fluid or use the fluid mechanics equations for sand. And blood is the same way, okay? And so technically blood is classified by what's known as a non-Newtonian fluid, okay? And what that means is that, the relationship between viscous shear stress and the velocity gradient of the fluid is not linear, okay? And so for a typical fluid, you have this relationship right here where you have sigma, where sigma here is the viscous shear stress, and that's just gonna be equal to the viscosity multiplied by the velocity gradient, okay? And so this is typically true for most fluid, but for blood, this technically is not the case, okay? And if you kind of remember from your fluids class, this relationship right here was kind of central, and this was kind of the key thing that we need to do in order to use the Navier-Stokes equations. Okay, but since blood doesn't satisfy this relationship, technically we can't use the Navier-Stokes equations to model blood. Okay, which kind of sucks because fluids it's hard enough, but when you start talking about suspensions, then actually the physics actually get a lot more complicated. But luckily for us, this non-Newtonian behavior of the blood is only really observed at the very, very tiniest of the vessels. So basically, only in the capillaries, okay? And so when you're talking about the flow of blood in some of the larger arteries, like the aorta or the vena cava, or basically all the blood vessels you can see without a microscope, there's been a lot of experiments that have been done that shows that blood basically acts like a Newtonian fluid, like it's 99.9% Newtonian, okay? And so it's only when you get to the smallest of vessels that you observe non-Newtonian fluids, okay? And so for the sake of this class, we're only gonna be looking at the biggest vessels. And so like the arteries, the big arteries and the big veins. And so we're going to assume that blood is a fluid. So we're going to be using things like Navier-Stokes and Bernoulli and things like that. Okay, but I just want you guys to kind of always remember that technically blood is not really a fluid because it has all of these cells. But for most cases, at least the ones that we're concerned about, we can assume that it behaves like a fluid. Okay, which is nice because fluids, even though fluids is really hard, it's still easier than trying to model sand, which is even harder. Okay. And so I wanted to show you this table here just to kind of show you kind of what I call like the dimensions of systemic circulation. So these show you kind of the relative sizes of the different vessels. Okay. And so let's look at I want to focus mostly on just the diameter right here. Okay. And so your aorta here, this is your biggest blood vessel in your body. And so this has a diameter of about 22 millimeters. And so that's about 2.2 centimeters, which is roughly about an inch. Okay. And so even though we talk about the aorta as the biggest blood vessel in your body, it really only has a diameter of about an inch. So it's still really, really tiny, in the grand scheme of things. Okay. And so, that's still pretty small, but that's as big as it gets basically. Okay. And so once you branch off the aorta, some of the larger arteries have a diameter of about 6 millimeters. Okay. And then once from there, you go a bit smaller, then those smaller arteries have a diameter of about 2. Okay. Then once you get down to the very smallest capillaries, you can see that these have a diameter of about 0.01 millimeters. Okay. And so that's really tiny. So you imagine, how small a millimeter is, and then think about 1% of that. That's how small a capillary is. So it's really, really tiny. Okay. And then once you leave the capillaries and you go back up, to the vena cava, you can see that the blood vessel sizes get bigger and bigger again. Okay. Because these have to get closer to the heart. And then you can see kind of some of the other stats that people have measured for these blood vessels as well. Okay. Okay. And so the last thing I want to talk about is pressure. Oh, but I see that there's a question in the chat. So let me open that up. Okay. So the question is inner diameter or outer diameter? Yeah, great question. So these are inner diameters. Yeah. Yeah. So outer. So the thickness of the vessel wall typically is about 10% of the radius. And so you can basically add maybe about 20% to this, and that's going to be your outer diameter. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about pressure. So pressure, since blood is basically an internal flow, so it mimics a lot like your piping system or your plumbing. Pressure is going to be the main driving force, for the flow. Okay, and so basically, we talked about before when your heart contracts, then your blood pressure is at a maximum, and so that pressure is going to be driving the flow throughout your bodies. Okay, and so what I have right here is kind of a profile of the pressure of your blood as it flows through your body. And so once your blood leaves your heart, you're at about a maximum blood pressure here. So this is your aorta, and then as you flow throughout your body, you enter your capillaries, your blood pressure drops quite a bit, and then it reaches a minimum down here in your vena cava, right? And then once your blood reaches the vena cava, then the blood goes back into your heart contracts, and then that contraction adds pressure to your flow, and then it goes on this ride again, okay? But pressure, is your main driving force, okay? All right, so just like we mentioned, so pressure is generally going to decrease as you move further and further away from the heart, and the main reason that pressure decreases is because of viscous losses, okay? And so basically everywhere in your body, or every time your blood passes through a blood vessel, it's going to lose some of its energy due to viscosity, or basically due to friction, okay? And that loss of energy is basically exhibited as a loss in pressure, okay? All right, so the absolute value of blood pressure is basically going to depend on the size and flexibility of the capillary bed, okay? And so because most of the pressure loss happens in your capillaries, basically, depending on how healthy your capillaries are, this graph can move kind of up or down, okay? And so what you're seeing right here is the graph of a relatively healthy person. So their average blood pressure is close to about 97 right here, which is, pretty healthy, okay? And that's because his capillaries are relatively, healthy, right? But if you're considering like an older person, what tends to happen with their capillaries is they tend to get smaller, okay? with time, and they tend to get more stiff. Okay, and so as your capillaries get smaller and stiffer, it's going to take more energy to kind of drive flow through those capillaries. And so in order to account for that, your overall blood pressure has to go up. Okay. And so for an older person, this graph might start somewhere up here, like 120, 130, okay? And then go down like that, okay? And so basically, the healthier capillaries are, the lower your blood pressure starts, okay? And so if you compare, the blood pressure to like a super athlete, like Michael Phelps or something, their blood pressure is going to be much lower because their cardiovascular system is so efficient, they don't need that much pressure to actually drive their flow. And so their blood pressure might be somewhere, over here, like in the 80s or 70s or even 60s, okay? And so which is really nice because that shows that their capillaries are really healthy, okay? Yeah, okay. I should have just clicked forward instead of just talking. Okay. And so, high blood pressure is kind of a disease that you hear pretty often, that people have. And another name for that is hypertension. And so if you hear that someone has hypertension, all that means is that they have high blood pressure, okay? And basically what that means is that, the higher your blood pressure is, the harder your heart has to work in order to pump blood through your body, okay? And so because if your blood basically has to generate a pressure of like 140, that takes a lot more work than having to generate a pressure of like 60, right? And so, if you spend a lot of your life at an elevated heart pressure, your heart space can be working hard all the time, okay? And so this is really dangerous because, your heart, is a muscle just like any of your other ones. And if it's constantly having to work hard and produce this high pressure, eventually it's just going to fatigue and it's just going to fail, right? And so, when people have high blood pressure, eventually that's going to put them at risk for heart failure because eventually their heart's going to say, this is too much work, having to pump up to 140 millimeters of mercury all the time, that takes a load on the heart, and that's eventually your heart's going to fail. Right? And so that's why it's really important, if you can, to manage your blood pressure through diet and exercise, just to make sure that, your resting blood pressure is not that high, so your heart doesn't have to work that hard. And so your heart can kind of stay healthier for longer, for your life, okay? Okay, any final questions on this? All right, so question. So what does it mean when you're in a relaxed state and you feel your heartbeat hard or drop like you're on a roller coaster? Yeah, so actually, your heart rate and, the amount of, how hard your heart works, it's also controlled and limited by your hormones as well. Right. So it's actually a very complex process that, involves your nervous system and your chemical hormone system as well. And so there could be some cases where, there might be just a hormone imbalance in your body or, some kink in your nervous system that causes, your heart rate to kind of go up and down. Right. It's like, when you're watching kind of a scary movie too, like, your heart starts to get a little bit faster because, the adrenaline starts to pump through your body. And so you're not doing anything strenuous in terms of physical activity, but, there are hormones that are triggering your heart to, in order to beat faster according to that situation. So it's a very, very complicated process. And it can go up or down depending on a lot of different things. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Professor Tran?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that that athletes tend to have lower blood pressure because their cardiovascular system's more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
What makes it more efficient? Like, is their heart just pushing like more efficiently, or are their veins larger, or arteries larger?
Yeah, it's a combination. It's a combination of a lot of those things. So, your heart, it's a muscle, just like any other muscle in your body. So the more you kind of strain it, the more you work it out, it gets kind of bigger and more muscular. So in those cases, it becomes just kind of more efficient to pump blood. But also, the blood vessels themselves, they kind of get bigger, they get more flexible. And believe it or not, actually more blood vessels tend to form. And so actually, if you look at kind of the capillary bed of someone that's kind of living a sedentary lifestyle versus an athlete, you'll see that an athlete has much more blood vessels that are connecting through their muscles because their muscles are demanding more blood, so they need more blood vessels to kind of deliver oxygen to more parts of their muscles. And so once that athlete starts to relax, those blood vessels don't go away, they kind of stay there. And so that provides basically more pathways for the blood to kind of operate through your body, which kind of lowers the amount of work that you have to do. Because if you can imagine, instead of squeezing blood through maybe one capillary, if you have like 5 capillaries, that's a lot easier to squeeze through because you have 5 times the amount of area. And so it's kind of a combination of those different things. A lot of it is due to kind of more blood vessels. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So can watching a scary movie be a replacement for exercise? No. And so, watching scary movies, it'll increase your heart rate, but it won't increase the amount of oxygen demand. And so that's really important. So you actually need to exercise, in order to do that. And plus, watching scary movies it's not going to burn you any calories either. And so part of the benefits of exercising is that you're actually burning energy in your body in the form of calories. And so that's going to help you kind of lose weight as well. Yeah. And right, yes, yeah. So Joshua brings up a good point. So the stronger your heart is, the more break time that you can have between breathing. Mm-hmm. All right, so questions. For valves, are the valves in the veins and arteries located only closer to the heart or in other areas of the body as well? Is it possible to place heart stents through a valve in the case of a blood clot in that area? Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So we only talked about valves in the heart, but there's actually a bunch of other valves and tiny blood valves in the rest of your body too. So actually, a lot of the veins have tiny blood valves as well. But those also tend to be kind of passive structures. And so you're asking about heart stents. And so it's definitely possible to pass a stent through a valve in order to repair kind of an area, because those valves are flexible. So it's not like if you stick something through it, it's not going to break the valve. The valve just it's basically just going to hit it and kind of be flexible. So obviously you don't want to have that happen for a long period of time, but for a short period of time, if you want to deploy a stent, you can do that, and the blood valve is going to be okay. Yeah, great questions, guys. All right, any other questions I can answer before we close shop for today? Okay, so if there's no more questions, that's all I had planned. Question. So we're removing the stent, reverse the valve. So a stent is actually a device that can that pushes out kind of the exterior of your. So it's basically a device used to kind of open up a blood vessel. So actually, you would never put a stent inside a valve itself, but you would kind of push it past the valve. So even if you remove the stent, the valve will still be okay. Yeah. Okay, so thank you everyone for tuning in today. So on Tuesday, I believe we're going to start our review on fluids. And so today we did a quick crash course in anatomy. So Tuesday we're going to bring it back to engineering. So we're going to talk about fluids. Okay. So have a great weekend, everyone. Don't remember to send me your email, and I'll see you next week. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Josh. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Hey, Dr. Chan.
Hey.
I'm currently enrolled in your 417 and the 442 class, this one.
Okay.
And I'm trying to make a decision between them because I know they're both computational. And I know you kind of sent me like a little message already, kind of, talking about the course load at least. But I really just kind of want to see what would be more, helpful for me, like moving forward in my career, because I kind of want to do like power and energy. That sounds really cool to me, and I really enjoy like the heat courses, like thermo was really fun and heat transfer.
Mhm.
But this whole like cardio class, I have a small background experience in like the medical field,
Mhm.
so it just interests me a lot. So I'm having a tough time.
Yeah. So yeah, it's tough because I think 417 it's called computational heat transfer, but I think probably a better name for it would be like introduction to like scientific computing, because we're basically going to learn how to take like a differential equation from scratch and then basically put that into code to solve it. So it's a good I think it's a really interesting class, but it's really only the first step. So like if you want to, if you say to me, if you ask, can I take 417 and then write, a code like ANSYS, I'd say there's still at least like 3 or 4 classes that you would need to take after 417. So 417 is kind of just the first step, whereas 442 I think is more kind of near the end of like, here are the tools and let's use them. So I think the thing that's going to be cool about 442, that I think actually would be applicable to like power and energy, is that we're actually going to use like a CFD software in 442, and that's going to be a big focus of this class. And so CFD software, even though we're going to use one that's specific to blood flow, a lot of the concepts and a lot of the ways that you set up the simulation are going to be similar to, like, say if you use a software that's specialized for like power and energy, because thermal and fluids, those are always going to be important for energy applications. So if you know how to set up a CFD simulation, that might be more useful for that. But I think like the concepts of like, conservation and thermal, that's going to be closer to 417. But I would say it's nothing that you haven't seen already in maybe like a heat transfer or thermal class. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's not what I expected you to say. I expected you to be more like, oh, take 417 rather
Yeah.
than 442. Okay.
Yeah. It's they're quite different, but so 442 in the grand scheme of things is very niche, but the fact that we are going to get to use a CFD software, that is a pretty marketable skill, and that's something that can be taken to other places. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I had a conversation earlier with Dr. Weiss,
Mhm.
and that's the other class I have because I have to take 2
Okay.
this semester. So I'm taking her controls class, and some of the jobs that I looked at, they emphasize like having some knowledge in controls.
I see.
So knowing like that information, would you still say that 442 would be more beneficial
Compared to controls.
compared to 417?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So if it's for controls, I would say or the synergy with controls, I'd say CFD probably has a little bit more synergy, because for 417, like we're really going to get into the weeds of like, how do we write a code like this? And so it's still a little bit separated. I mean, eventually down the road, you could, it has applications with controls, but it's like, 2 or 3 classes out from that. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't mind taking like a strictly like computational class, just because I feel like my coding is a little weak. Like I enjoy it. I just feel like
Mhm.
it could be stronger. So that's
Yeah.
why like 417 kind of enticed me.
Yeah. 417, you will definitely build coding skills a lot better, because we're gonna be doing a lot of what I call like good programming practices for that. So like we'll learn basically like how to set up a code. How do you define your variables? How do you organize your loops and things like that? That's typically industry standard. And so that's kind of what I mentioned in my previous message, where those kind of skills would be kind of transferable to industry too. Because in this class, when we use the CFD software, we'll write some MATLAB code, but it's not going to be like kind of what I call like kind of fundamental stuff in terms of programming. It's going to be very applied. So my approach with MATLAB in 442 will be like, here's an example code, and we'll talk about how to set it up and everything like that. But it's going to be a much more niche thing compared to 417.
Okay. So just to kind of uh end it on this conversation, you're suggesting 442 would be the better class to take, just to kind of apply that to like an engineering career, like when I graduate?
Yeah, specifically the use. I would say there's these two distinctions. So 417 I think would be the class to take if you want to kind of learn kind of good programming practice and kind of get better and more confidence with that. 442 I think would be a class where if you want to get experience with using a CFD software, I'm gonna have you guys use a supercomputer, so there's some experience there too. And so those are also skills to do. So those are some good skills. So I think it's kind of a matter of what you want to prioritize versus like where it's the where if you think programming is going to be good, programming is going to be more important down the line. I would say 417 is good for that. But if you want like experience with like a CFD software and using a supercomputer, then 442 would be a good option for that.
That sounds so cool. Like I think if you put that into the course description, I think this class would have filled up way sooner. I mean, it's still full right now, but that's so cool.
I see. Yeah, it's it'll be fun. It'll be fun.
All right, I guess I have a tough decision to make then.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dr. Tran, for answering my questions.
Yeah, no
sorry
problem.
about that, Simon, for taking forever.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, go ahead, take your time. All right, Simon, your question. Yes, it will count. Yeah, so it's I think it's still processing. So Dr. Weiss told me they're still working on the paperwork, but it will definitely count for tech elective. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, have a good night.